Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I'm Will England, editor-in-chief of Rock Solid Apologia, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Oz Guinness back to the podcast. Dr. Guinness is the author and editor of more than 35 books, including The Dust of Death, The Call, Fool's Talk, Carpe Diem Redeemed, which I think I mispronounced, The Magna Carta of Humanity, Last Call for Liberty, Impossible People, Unspeakable, and The Time for Truth. He is the founder of Trinity Forum, a prominent social critic and a frequent speaker who has addressed audiences worldwide. Guinness has a lifelong passion to make sense of our extraordinary modern world and stand between the worlds of scholarship and ordinary life, helping each to understand the other, particularly when advanced modern life touches on the profound issues of faith. Passionate advocate of freedom of religion and conscience for people of all faiths and nones. He was the lead drafter for both the Williamsburg Charter and the Global Charter of Conscience. He lives with his wife, Jenny, in the Washington, D.C. area. Welcome back to the world's one and only apologetics podcast, satire podcast, Dr. Guinness.
Thank you, Will. A real pleasure to be back with you.
I've been looking forward to the conversation. I wanted to start with, I don't know, is 0 Hour America your most recent book, or have you had a book more recent than that?
No, I've had actually two since then, but
do you want to tell the audience a little bit about those, and then we can go back to 0 Hour America?
well, they're different. They're actually closer to your interest in apologetics. The first one's called The Great Quest, A Thinking Person's Search for Meaning. And the most recent one is called Signals of Transcendence. And it's the story, 10 stories of people who experience these profound signals, which set them off to be searchers. And eventually they came to faith. But the signal of transcendence was the crucial thing in their life which triggered it.
That Signals of Transcendence is such a terrific title.
Mm-hmm. I liked it. I got the idea from Peter Berger, who was my mentor.
So I wanted to go back to 0 Hour America, which I thought was a lot of your stuff in there was really interesting. So I wanted to begin with the first few sentences of your book, because you had a really, really catching introduction to that. You write, "Howl, America, howl. Howl like the Hebrew prophets howled over the fate of their people before the destruction of the Jerusalem in 586 BC. Why start your book that way? And then maybe give us a cultural diagnosis of where America is at."
Well, it's hard to really put into words the sorrow, the outrage, the anguish that I sometimes feel as a foreign admirer of this country when you see Americans squandering their great heritage of freedom almost in a single generation. And yet there are so few people who are really speaking up in terms of some of these foundational issues. So I wanted to express something of how I truly feel.
You said it started within a single generation. Would you point to like the 50s or the 60s as to when our current decline started?
Well, we can trace a lot of it back to the 60s generation. You could say, particularly if you're looking at the ideological polarization between those who understand America from the perspective of the American Revolution and those who understand it from the perspective of ideas from the French Revolution. A lot of the impact of that goes back to 1968, because that was the year the radicals called for a long march through the institutions. And since then, that's a little over 50 years, they've made incredible inroads. No one would have believed in 68 that bastions like business, conservative bastions, or the military would have been infiltrated. But now we've got woke business and woke military. And you can see how incredibly far the long march has gone and how incredibly effective it's been.
It's interesting. I've noticed, and I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I'm not that old, or don't have that much experience behind me. But it's interesting. You read the news, and it's like both sides. It's they look at the same events, but they do not see the same thing. It's almost like the country lives in two different realities at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. But, revolutions are like worldviews. Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto that communism has solved the riddle of existence. That's a huge claim. In other words, it's a philosophy. It's virtually a secular religion. And if you put it on as a filter, you see the whole world one way. And if you look at it as a Jewish perspective and a Christian perspective, you see it a different way. In other words, worldviews are like lenses that shape how people see.
And I'm not sure if it's always been so obvious, the disparate worldviews, but it's like today you can look at the world and you can see that people obviously come from very different perspectives and very different presuppositions.
Well, they've always been that different, but in the pre-modern world, they weren't all living in the same society. And, one of the things that social scientists say is everyone is now everywhere. In other words, for most of 2,000 years, the Christian faith, which is obviously rooted in Judaism, was the dominant faith of the West. And while there were a few Muslims and there were a certain number of atheists and things like that, there weren't very many. And most people shared the same worldview, but not today.
I don't remember which British diplomat you referenced in your book, but you had a reference to a British diplomat who came to America in like the 1860s or something like that. And he looked at our culture and said, because we haven't got tradition to hold us together, the only thing that holds the United States together is religion. Did I get that right from that diplomat?
A little later, it was Lord James Bryce, who is often reckoned to be the second most important foreign commentator in America. And he was Queen Victoria's ambassador to the US, and he wrote around 1900. And you're right. I mean, he said in Europe, you have tradition and you have social cohesion. People live in towns and small villages. They know each other. Things are held together. But in America, freedom, mobility, move on, move on, move on. Nothing holds America together, he said, except religion. Now, in 1900, it was inconceivable to him that religion would decline in America and weaken. But now that's so here. And he speculates if it ever would, and here I'm quoting, it would produce the completest revolution of all. And I think that's one of the American crises we're seeing today. I call it, following Rabbi Sachs, cultural climate change.
So go into cultural climate change a little bit more, and you also talk about the writing on the wall for America. What are some of the cultural climate changes we're seeing, and what's some of the writing on the wall we're looking at?
Well, put it simply, cultural climate change comes through the convergence of four trends. First, a crisis of faith. Second, a crisis of truth. Third, an erosion or breakdown of social ties like the family. And fourth, a general undermining of trust. Because if you think, well, you have high faith, you have high truth, you have high trustworthiness, and you can have high trust and high freedom. But if each of them goes, you have a very low trustworthiness and low trust. And trust in American institutions, families, schools, churches, courts, journalism, the presidency, and above all, Congress, trust in Congress is around 8%, which is absolutely appalling. Trust has broken down because of this crisis of faith and truth. and the social ties. That's cultural climate change.
I mean, trust and truth have to go right along together because you can't trust if you don't have truth.
No, that's right. High truth, high trustworthiness, and then high trust. Now, you need to have a standard higher than the individual. In other words, under God, as it used to be said, following Lincoln. And you need to have models of people who are living with integrity and trustworthiness so that other people are inspired to live that way and be trusting themselves. But all of that's broken down. Who trusts who? Solzhenitsyn used to say that in Stalin's Soviet Union, the worldview was suspicion. No truth, only power. Everyone has an agenda. You're out to gore my ox, and I'm out to gore yours. I just don't know what your agenda is, so I've got to be suspicious. What the philosophers call the hermeneutics of suspicion. Well, that's deadly. Everyone wary, looking over their own shoulder. No one trusts anyone. Well, that was the Soviet Union. Increasingly, that's where America is today. So you take the sexual revolution. Every man is a potential assailant of every woman, and every woman is a potential accuser of every man. And so you have relations between men and women which are fraught in America now, and so on.
I have a quote from William Penn in front of me that goes similar to what you're saying. If men will not be governed by God, then they must be governed by tyrants, which seems to be the direction we're going.
John Adams says much the same thing. Our Constitution was only produced for people who are moral and religious. And apart from that, he said, people's behavior will break through the Constitution as a whale breaks through the net. Or Edmund Burke, the great Irish statesman, said, you can't have freedom unless you put chains on appetites. In other words, you've got to limit power and give a framework around desire, or human desire, and the lust for power just runs away with you.
So I want to come back to the discuss freedom a little bit more, but there was one other quote along these same lines that was at the beginning of your book from a historian named Arnold Toynbee. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. He says, of the 22 civilizations that have appeared in history, 19 of them collapsed when they reached the moral state the United States is in now. What did he mean by that quote? Which societies was he looking at? And then what are some of the similar behaviors that we're seeing?
Well, let me take, the great historian of freedom is Lord Acton, and his description of the fall of Athens. So he says, Athens was the first city-state in the world to flourish through democracy, the will of the people. But he said the trouble came, the will of the people became unbounded. The will of the people was sovereign. There was nothing to stop them doing what they wanted to do. The majority in Athens soon became the tyranny of the majority and undermined democratic freedom. And Bertrand Russell, who's a grand old atheist, I remember him as a student, he argues the same thing happened not only in Greece, but in Renaissance Italy. In other words, people lost faith and lost ethics, so there was no boundaries. And when things were unbounded, they just undermined themselves. And as you know, Will, the bookends of history are anarchy and authoritarianism. Anarchy is all freedom, no order. And authoritarianism is all order, no freedom. But the first one leads to the second one. In other words, when it's all freedom and no order, everyone for themselves, you have chaos and violence. And then people long for order and stability and a strong man or a strong government, and you end up with what Thomas Hobbes called Leviathan, the mortal god of the state, an increased bloated government. So these things are incredibly simple to understand. My wife often reminds me of James Cameron's film, The Titanic. I'm sure you've seen that. The Titanic was considered unsinkable because it had a bottom with these airtight compartments. But when it was gashed by the iceberg, 5 of them were gashed. If 1 or 2 had been holed, it might have survived. But 5? No, the engineer said, no, we're made of iron and the ship will sink. And then he says, it's a mathematical certainty. Now, if you think of that, it's not a mathematical certainty, it's a logical certainty that freedom has to be lived a certain way if freedom is to last. And if people don't live that way, freedom will be undermined. And it's a mathematical certainty. In America, the ship of state will go down in terms of the freedom of the great republic.
So I feel like, I mean, freedom is, as you pointed out, like, what does America cherish most? It's freedom. How would you define freedom versus how is freedom being defined today in popular culture?
Freedom is so simple and so wonderful that actually there are all sorts of lookalikes and confusing frauds. So Lord Acton used to say, freedom is not the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought. In other words, again, freedom requires a framework. Or I was at Oxford with Sir Isaiah Berlin, and he often used to say, freedom has a negative side and a positive side. So the negative side of freedom is freedom from. Nobody's free if they're under the control of anything outside themselves, whether a drug or a bully or a dictator. You've got to be free from. But that's only half of freedom. The other half of freedom is free for, freedom to be who you are. And for that sort of freedom, you need truth. You think of the words of Jesus, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Are we, as humans, machines? Are we just animals? Or are we, in fact, made in the image of God? It'll be the truth of who we are that sets us free to be who we are. So freedom is easy to say, but there's a lot of freedoms today that are very inadequate. And we've got to challenge people to think through. Now, the odd thing is, I think this is the nub of the present thing. Many of our atheist friends and our secular friends, they have no freedom at all. In other words, in the ancient world, people were ruled by fate. You think of Oedipus, the story of Oedipus. You know, the oracle says this, and Oedipus and his parents do everything to beat the oracle, but everything they do makes certain that what the oracle said comes true. That's fate, tragic fate. And you can only look on with terror and pity, fate. Now, in our modern world, we don't believe in fate, but our secularist friends only have determinism. So Marx believed in economic determinism, Freud in psychological determinism, Richard Dawkins in genetic determinism, and so on. If you think of all the factors that shape us, we can never do other than we do. That's determinism. The biblical position is stubbornly and gloriously different. In other words, both Jews and Christians believe that a free God has made people in his image with the possibility of freedom, even after we go wrong. So even some Christians think that once we've sinned, or once sin came into the world, we don't have freedom. But actually, when the Lord speaks to Cain, just before he murders his brother Abel, the Lord says sin is crouching at the door. He's aware of what Cain is thinking, but reminds him he has a choice. And of course, even when we've done badly wrong, we still have the freedom, with the help of the Holy Spirit, to repent and turn around. So freedom is a very important Christian and Jewish conviction over against modern atheism.
So this is a little off script, but I just wanted to throw this out there and see what you thought. Does Calvinism undermine biblical freedom in that sense?
No, but some Calvinists do.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. That was just one of the.
In other words, they've majored on the fruits of sin and the bondage of sin. And, the way the rabbis put it from Genesis is that sin starts like as thin as a spider's web. But if you make a choice that's bad and go wrong and do wrong again and again and again, the spider's web grows and grows and grows until it's as thick as a cart rope, as they put it. You might say as thick as a great chain that pulls in a liner to the docks. And that is sin. So you take someone like Pharaoh. As you begin the challenge of Moses to Pharaoh, Moses is not free. He's pleading for freedom. Let my people go. Pharaoh is the freest man in the world as the Egyptian Pharaoh. But by the end of the story and the bad decisions he's made, even his courtiers are all against him, but he will not change his mind. He's so stubborn and convinced. And so we can do wrong and go wrong and think wrong until we reach the point of obsession or we reach the point of addiction. Obsessions in our thinking or addictions in our behavior, where we've lost almost all freedom. Now, that's tragic. And so certainly a lot of the hyper-Calvinists overstress that and lose the position of freedom altogether.
So freedom simply defined is not permission to do what you like, but power to do what you ought.
Yeah, and to make a good choice.
Going right along with that, I find it interesting, not only are people questioning what freedom is, they don't seem sure what totalitarianism is anymore either. I was in a class, a Western civilization class. We were getting towards the end and we're talking about modern politics. And the subject was authoritarianism. And the example of authoritarianism was the government of Hungary for banning LGBTQ plus material being taught in elementary school. And I asked him about that. I asked him if he'd think that would be a totalitarian or indoctrination if Christians taught children the Christian view of marriage. And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. So I asked him what the difference was. And he just wasn't sure. But I mean, it's just interesting, like totalitarianism doesn't mean much anymore either.
Well, we got to be clear. I said the two bookends of history, anarchy and authoritarianism, all order, no freedom. Now, in the modern world, following the Enlightenment, they said the Enlightenment in one word was reason. And if you apply reason to the whole of life in a managerial way, everything ruled by reason, that slowly becomes authoritarian. And with modern technology and surveillance, slowly becomes totalitarian. And that's extremely dangerous. I think it's very unfair to say that about Viktor Orban, because he's actually complaining against much of the authoritarianism of the EU. It's just that one man's authority is another man's authoritarianism, and people don't like what Orban stands for, and they like what they stand for. But you think of the LGBT, they are as authoritarian as anyone.
Right, because you can't have differing perspectives. I sometimes wonder, like, it doesn't seem to be much of a discussion, though oftentimes, not always the case, but oftentimes the left votes the exact same way. There are defections on the right.
Yeah. The last time I spoke at the United Nations, at least 3 ambassadors came up from small nations in the Pacific, and they said, we resent the colonialism of America, by which they meant the way that LGBTQ policies were being coerced on them in an authoritarian way. In other words, unless they went along with them, which were totally against their values, they wouldn't get any US aid. Now, that is rampant, coercive colonialism, from the left, which pretends to be anti-colonial. In other words, many of them are very hypocritical.
I got into a discussion with one of the guys in my class at one point, and he was protesting that Christians don't fire at churches.
You know
LGBT.
what?
They don't hire. Sorry, I think I said fire. They don't hire LGBTQ plus people in churches.
You're right. Well, they equally, you could say, if you go to many organizations today, a test and a litmus test of the applications is, do you accept inclusiveness and the LGBTQ and so on? In other words, they would never hire anyone who disagreed with them. Now, that's fair enough. We all have different views. We believe that God's way, the most human way, is for men to be men and women to be women. And the difference between male and female is a distinction that's very important. For those who are postmodern, that's wrong. Now, we disagree with them, but we should understand why they do, and they should understand why we do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I asked him, like, what would it be wrong then to fire someone who has Christian values in a secular organization?
No, they do that.
And he said, well, no, it wouldn't be. And it's like, okay, so what's the difference? In one hand, it's okay, and in another hand, it's not. So going along with that, I liked your take on you have criticisms of both the left and the right. Why do you feel that the left deserves a bit more of a watchful eye, shall we put it, than the right does?
Well, let's be clear. I use the word conservative and liberal positively, and right and left negatively. A lot of people use those the same way. But I would say both the right and the left are wrong and dangerous. So you have on the right some pretty bad extremes, ugly, non-Christian, and so on. But for all that, the key question is, where is the right powerful and where is the left powerful? And social scientists would use the word social location. Now, the left is powerful in academia, in journalism, in the corporate world, in the entertainment world, in the intelligence world, in the world of bureaucracy, and now coming in even into the US Congress and even into the White House and foreign policy. In other words, the left has power in social locations which are far more powerful than the extremes of the right. So I'm not in favor of the right, but the left is a far greater danger in America.
So then shifting to the practical, what can Christians do on an individual level? What can Christians do about the crisis or the civilizational moment we're in as Americans?
Well, first, pray, because there are dimensions of this that are quite beyond just human battles and certainly beyond us as individuals. So we should all pray for revival in the church and that God's kingdom will come. So prayer is incredibly important. But then in terms of what we individually do, I think the key notion is calling. God has given each of us gifts, and we're to exercise and use those gifts in the spheres in which we live. I often challenge people, map out your world. All of us live in a home. But then just outside the home is a neighborhood. And then outside that is our workplace with all our colleagues. And then through that, with our gifts and our work, we have ripples of influence to go further. A doctor has clients, a journalist has readers, and you go on down the line. If everyone maps out all the spheres, our little circles are small. None of us is hugely influential. But when we all are faithful in our spheres in every area to the full extent that we can be, together, we are salt and light and transforming agents in society. So instead of being overwhelmed, as so many are, what on earth can I do? I'm just one person. If we each map out the spheres of our influence and our callings, and we are faithful where we are and in all we do, then together we really can make a difference.
So another thing I wanted to, this kind of goes into Christian nationalism, or people being concerned about Christian nationalism, Christians being involved per se. I've noticed in the news, I mean, I didn't see that term until very recently, but now it's all over the news. I think there was a film that came out recently documenting the threat about Christian nationalism. What is Christian nationalism, and what's your take on it?
I think the use of the phrase as an insult and an epithet is utterly bogus and unfair. So start with a simple fact. As George Orwell, an atheist, he says there's a huge difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is love of your country. Every human being needs meaning, make sense of the world, and belonging. You've got to find a place in the world, and purpose, those three. But patriotism speaks to the second one, belonging, patriotism. Now, you can love your part of the world. I'm not American, you're American, I'm sure you love America. My family's from Ireland. I love Ireland and England where I grew up. It's perfectly valid to be patriots. We should be. Now, that doesn't mean we support our country right or wrong. We are not uncritical. And the trouble with nationalism is it's uncritical. In other words, it's idolatrous. You tend to worship a nation uncritically. But people are using that phrase, and I would say it's bogus because it was picked up first by academics. And it's doubly bogus for them because they today are globalists against nationalists. And globalism is much an idolatry today as nationalism used to be. In fact, if you look at the great age of nationalism in the 19th century, or say Hitler in the 20th century, the problem with nationalism, it didn't stay in the nation. Nations became imperialistic and tried to conquer other nations. So we are against, I think, as followers of Jesus, we're against nationalism. Nationalism is an idolatry. But the critics say that every patriot, everyone who stands for America, is a nationalist. And that's what's quite unfair, because often they are really globalists without admitting it.
What I find scary is that legislation consistent with Christian values is Christian nationalism, but legislation consistent with secular values, I mean, somehow or another, it's like, when Christians legislate based on their values, that's dangerous, and that's somehow different than secularists legislating based on their values.
Well, it's become an insult.
Right.
You just level it against whoever you don't like.
Right.
And that's what the left are doing. And sadly, we've got some smart aleck evangelical scholars who do the same things too. And every Christian who stands for patriotism, they dismiss as a nationalist. And that's wrong. I should have said, another of the crises, we talked about the ideological polarization, another of the American crises is the institutional polarization. That was the gap between elites and ordinary people. So you have Hillary Clinton talking about the basket of deplorables and Donald Trump talking about the forgotten people. They're the same people. So ironically, many Democrats talk about saving democracy, but actually what they mean is they are the elites doubling down on their elitism, attacking ordinary people. So again, we got to expose a lot of this bad talk. The rhetoric is unfair and wrong, and we got to challenge it cheerfully.
Democracy is another one of those terms that is very loosely defined, because often what it irons out to mean, right or left, is you're challenging us, therefore you're challenging democracy.
Yeah. Well, America is a republic.
Right.
From the Hebrew Republic. The framers were rather chary of democracy. But we're not against democracy as Christians, but take the most famous saying on democracy. If you ask most Americans what it is, they would quote Lincoln at Gettysburg. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, Lincoln was quoting. Many people don't realize that. He was quoting a pastor in Boston. But the important thing is, who was the pastor quoting? The pastor was quoting John Wycliffe in the 14th century, in 1385. And what Wycliffe was saying is something very important. If we take the Bible out of Latin into English and out of the hands of the priests and into the hands of ordinary people, then the Bible will make possible self-government and government of the people, by the people, for the people. Now, that's wonderful, because the toughest thing today, which is democracy has just become a matter of head counting. No, real democracy should be self-government. So you want individual self-government and local government and national government and to some extent global government. But there should be a sovereignty at every single level, not just in the capital and in Geneva or wherever. So self-government should be a very precious idea for Christians, because living free in Christ is a way of true freedom and true self-government.
It's interesting that you bring up the Bible in English, because I feel like that was one of the major ways that the medieval Catholic Church went wrong. I mean, the Bible was not in the hands of laymen. So people were not having their own faith. I mean, it was passed down to them. And I just wonder, if the Bible had been available for laymen to interpret, would you have had things like the Inquisition? I mean, Luther opposed the Crusades, for instance.
Yeah, and William Tyndale, who was the first great translator, longed that every plowboy in England could read the Bible. That's wonderful. Now, if you think, though, if you look at the knowledge revolution, before the alphabet, you had hieroglyphs and pictograms, and knowledge was the preserve of the elites, either the palace or the temple. Now, if you had 6,000 letters, how could any ordinary people master them? But the invention of the alphabet was democratic in the sense it reduced the alphabet, first of all, 26 letters, a few more now. But the point is, ordinary people could manage it. And so you had the growth of literacy and the alphabet and democracy, as it were. And there's a wonderful story, as the scholars point out. If you read, I think it's Judges, Gideon is about to attack a town, and he captures a teenager, your age, Will. And he asks the teenager to write down the names of the leaders in the town. And the teenager is able to write 70-odd names. Scholars point out, you pass over that quickly. I think it's Judges 8, somewhere like that. That's incredibly important. Ordinary people had writing. And there's always been in Judaism and also the gospel. So when the Irish, sailed from Ireland into France, they took the gospel and literacy and education. And that, of course, was part of the seeds of Christendom.
It's just amazing how when the Bible becomes widespread knowledge, widespread abuses of power, like we saw in the Middle Ages, from the church, is not nearly as common. I mean, you have it individual churches, individual pastors, but you don't have it institutionally anymore.
No, that's right. Well, in the Bible itself, we talk of separation of powers. You've got the executive and the legislature and the judiciary. But in the Bible, you have what the Jews called 3 crowns of authority: the king, the priest, and the prophet. And they were all supposed to be servants of the covenant, and the role of the prophet was the conscience. So when people went astray or the king abused his power, Nathan could challenge David, Elijah could challenge Ahab. And so it goes. And all of that's a biblical idea. The prophet is the world's first social critic who, in the name of the Lord, could challenge truth to power. And these ideas are very simple, but they're incredibly important today. And it was the Reformation which rediscovered those. So this is controversial, but you look at when Rome declared the Christian faith was the official religion of Rome in 380. The church made a bad mistake of copying Roman structures. So Rome had a Caesar and consuls and senators, and the church had a pope and cardinals and bishops. Now, that was hierarchical. And it was a Catholic layman who attacked that when he said all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was talking about his own church in that remark. Now, the Reformation came and they said, no, that was Rome. That isn't the biblical way. What is the biblical way of politics? It's covenantal. You go back to Exodus and Deuteronomy, covenantal. Now, in Exodus, you have the origin of the consent of the governed, and so on. So the Bible is a huge advance in terms of modern freedom.
I've often find myself pushing back at school. It's like the Reformation is minuscule and the Enlightenment is huge. It's like, I think the Reformation had at least as big of an impact. I mean, I think the Enlightenment came out of the Reformation, amongst other things, because it had that democratizing effect. You had the Bible in everyday language.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one historian I read recently, the Reformation created the modern world. Now, it wasn't always exactly as the reformers had in mind, but the Reformation was an explosively powerful movement, tied in, of course, with the invention of printing, and therefore the Bible. The Reformation created the modern world.
So I wanted to end on a positive note about, at least what I perceive to be a positive note about current culture, which is the rise of the culturally Christian intellectuals, like the push further and further. People like Ion Hersey Ali and Douglas Murray. I mean, I think even Richard Dawkins said, although it may have been taken out of context, that he is culturally Christian. What do you make of that phenomenon, if you want to call it that, of these public intellectuals who used to be very hostile to God, all of a sudden doing a 360-degree turn?
Well, I think what's happening is very significant, but a lot of Christians are exaggerating what is happening. It's significant because 20, 30 years ago, you had Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, the God delusion, flat out rejection of faith. Now you have an enormous appreciation because they realize that religion or faith is indispensable to the rise and the survival of Western civilization. Now, of the people you mentioned, Ion Hersey Ali, whom I know, has genuinely become a Christian. And she would say it's a matter of the heart. Now, it's true that she came that way by seeing the significance of the Christian faith in so many of the Western values that she appreciates. Jordan Peterson, almost there. Tom Holland, the great historian, is said to be close. Now, Richard Dawkins, no. What he says clearly is he is an Anglican Christian, by which he means he loves his college chapel, and on Sunday evening, the beauty and the quiet of evensong. Well, that has nothing to do with being a believer, and he's a hardcore atheist still. So he says that rather tongue-in-cheek, and I don't think that's anything to do with revival. Douglas Murray, I don't know Douglas. He's a wonderful thinker. Exactly where he is, I don't know. So the movement is significant. But don't mistake civilizational Christians for those who really know the Lord.
Right. There's a difference between intellectually saying, okay, Christianity made a difference, and okay, Jesus is my Lord and Savior.
That's right. But, people come different ways. There are as many ways to God as there are people who come, although Jesus is finally the only way to the Lord. And so there are people who come in all sorts of different ways, not just one way. And so undoubtedly, as the West sinks, And people realize we're in a cut flower civilization, and the flowers that have died have a stench, and some of the others are wilting rather badly now. They realize, wow, what made them what they were, beautiful. And it was the Christian faith, or Christian faith rooted in Judaism. So you look at you want a human-friendly future. What are some of the things you need? You need a high view of human worth. What's the highest? Humans made in the image of God, Genesis 1. You need a high view of truth. You need a high view of words. You need a high view of freedom. You need a high view of justice and peace and covenant, going down the line. Where are all those things? In the Bible. And if you rule out the Bible, you cut the roots and those things die.
And it's like people are waking up slowly to, okay, if we're going to cut that out, we got to take the rest of it. I think it was Nietzsche who started thinking through the implications. What does it actually mean that God is dead? It's more than just an intellectual statement.
No, that's right. His famous parable of the madman. We have killed him, you and I. But he says, the people laughing superciliously. No, he says, we've unhinged the sun. We've wiped away. Who will wipe the blood off our hands? How do you solve guilt without the cross, and so on? So Nietzsche was impatient with what he called the odious windbags of progressive optimism, by which he was talking about people who could say, God is dead, give me another cocktail. Everything's the same. No. If God is dead, then Europe goes into the abyss, and the West does now, and America.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to join us again on the podcast. Is there somewhere listeners can go and find more of your material?
My website, small one, osguinness.com. But a lot of what I said here and there is on the YouTube and around the web. But great to be with you, Will, again. We said if God is dead, things have consequences. We should say, of course, and thank God he's alive and we know him well.
Right. And with that, that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetics satire podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.